You and I have seen it. That North Carolina sky held that specific pale gold shade that shines right before a massive breakthrough happens. Down below at the Sterling Apex Motorsports test track, every flashy camera, every greedy executive, every investor gathered to applaud the stage, desperate for a flashy rebirth of a racing empire. The Apex R9, a $14 million prototype. It sat under the soft launch lights like a polished black blade. But deep in the back of the technical bay, wearing dark blue overalls heavy with thick engine grease, stood a quiet, grease-stained father named Flynn, hearing the tiny defect the famous crowd completely missed. He was 29, built broad, with short, neat brown hair, and tired, gentle eyes that showed he had lost far more than he would ever admit. To the spotlight-chasing engineers, he was just an invisible, grease-stained mechanic on the floor. None of them realized that the slight dry knock hiding beneath the engine roar was the first whisper of a disaster that would destroy everything. But the entire brand, and that Flynn, with his dirty hands and a name completely ignored by the stage-walking executives, was the only person in the room who truly understood. Vivian Sterling, 28, the new chief executive of the brand her late father built, stepped onto the small stage with the practiced grace of a leader who rehearsed her confident smile in mirrors. She wore a cream dress under a tailored black blazer, her chestnut hair falling loose around her shoulders. Her voice sounded perfect, promising the wealthy room a return to glory. Behind her, the Apex R9 sat like a promise waiting to be tested. Flynn heard that knock again, sharp, subtle, dry, hiding beneath the hum like a sick heartbeat that did not belong. He turned to a young engineer named Otis Warren and warned him calmly that the car must not run. Otis stared at his tablet, saw 0 warning lights, and shrugged. Dermot Blake, the loud, proud head of engineering, a tall man of 44 with sharp cheekbones and a brutal temper, stepped in with complete disrespect. He snapped that Flynn was hired to scrub tools, not touch million-dollar prototypes. The raw data, he announced loudly, did not lie. But you and I know the spotlight misses quiet truths. Flynn knew an ignition map slightly out of phase with the cylinder pressure could fool every computer sensor and still blow an engine to pieces in 3 seconds flat. He understood what the famous suits never could, the difference between a perfectly healthy machine and one already screaming in pain. And he realized with terrifying certainty the Apex R9 was about to be sent out to break. This is where you and I pay attention. Flynn finally moved. He stepped past Otis and 2 very shocked technicians, past the velvet rope separating invisible mechanics from the shining prototypes, and popped the auxiliary engine panel open. With one smooth, silent motion, he unhooked the secondary fuel line. With his other hand, he unclipped a glowing coupler from a race connector running dangerously hot. The massive engine sputtered once, released a breath of white smoke, and went quiet. Look at the chaos. The crowd turned around as a loud voice lashed across the garage. He just sabotaged the prototype vehicle. Vivian stepped off her stage, flashing camera lenses chasing her every single move. She only saw a nameless mechanic with greasy hands standing by the smoking car. Her mind was wound tight from months of brutal pressure from a doubting board of directors. She instantly did the cold math that her corporate training demanded. This was a major public relations disaster, playing out directly in front of the brand's most critical investors. And a quiet, unrecognized worker stood right at the center of the storm. Flynn calmly tried to explain. If you let that car run, the engine will come apart at speed. Vivian's face went rigid. He looked her right in the eyes with a steady voice and open hands. You can fire me later, he said, but first please check the ignition map. Don't put the car back on the track. But the screaming panic in her head drowned him out. She could feel the heavy stares of the corporate board members. She heard the toxic whisper she had carried since taking her father's CEO chair, that she was just a fragile heir trying to fill a legendary father's massive shoes. And so, in front of flashing cameras, rich investors, and a girl clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, she made the fastest, most brutal decision of her entire career. You are fired, she said. Leave the testing grounds now. That child behind the ropes was 6-year-old Louisa, with hair the color of golden wheat. Her wide, terrified eyes stared over the stuffed rabbit she held tight against her chest. Her mother had given her that very rabbit. And her mother was no longer in this world. You and I know the truth. Her only real anchor was that quiet man in overalls who fixed everything. Little Louisa slipped under the velvet rope and ran straight to her father's side. She glared up at the executive in the cream dress, speaking in a small, brave voice of a kid who knew nothing of corporate deals, but everything about her dad. He didn't break the car. My dad does everything that is hurt. Vivian's jaw clenched tight. She stubbornly refused to look down at the little girl. Your father broke protocol, she announced, as the veteran mechanics in the room silently lowered their eyes. The quiet genius simply knelt down in front of his daughter. He gently wiped a stray tear from her cheek with the back of his thumb. Come on, sweetheart, he whispered, keeping his voice low so only she could hear. Let's go. I really do not want you remembering me by this moment. He unclipped his company badge, handing it to a guard who could not look him in the eye. Then he gently took Louisa's tiny hand in his own. Without arguing once and without raising his voice, he walked her past rows of gleaming race cars she had always been taught to admire. Think about it. He walked right past the very trophies he silently built, heading out toward the empty parking lot. Little Louisa glanced back just once, confused why the racing garage her dad built was suddenly turning its back on him so completely. Vivian merely watched him walk out. She had no idea she just fired the quiet mechanic who actually built every championship car in that hallway, and that the struggling racing brand she fought to save would in just a few hours rely entirely on him. 3 days before that prototype engine knocked. You and I recognized the type. His day began quietly in that rented home 20 minutes from the Sterling Apex track. On his bedroom wall hung a photograph. His late wife cradling baby Louisa bundled tight in a soft hospital blanket. But he never stared at the frame for long. Since she passed, he realized that carrying heavy grief is much easier if you just keep moving forward and never stand still. He toasted some bread, fried a couple of eggs, and poured milk into a small blue cup. His daughter stood there with messy, tangled hair, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit under her arm, asking him in that same soft voice she had used for nearly a year if he could please braid her hair the exact way her mother used to. Flynn truly tried, he always did. But the braid always ended up crooked and loose. Yet Louisa just giggled, loving the effort every time. Flynn smiled back, silently reminding himself of a simple truth he held close to his heart: that his most important job on Earth had nothing to do with building high-performance engines. Driving his beat-up truck toward the elementary school, Louisa traced shapes on the foggy glass, wondering why he was no longer the lead racing mechanic, like in those old dusty photos she discovered in a shoebox in his closet. Flynn paused at a red light. The most vital job I will ever have, he told her, is being your dad. Everything else is really just work. She nodded like that made perfect sense. To a 6-year-old who lost her mother, it truly did. Back at Sterling Apex, we watched him work quietly in the bay just as he had for decades. He clocked in before the flashy engineers to prep his tools. I saw him listen to a roaring engine the way most people listen to beautiful music. The younger mechanics just walked right past him, completely blind. We joked that old Flynn was our radio, always tuned to the quiet frequency of the racing car. He never once corrected us. He did not care if the rookies knew about his legendary past. Tucked away in a dark break room corner hidden behind those flashy new trophies, hung a faded photo of a young Flynn standing beside a bearded man with remarkably gentle eyes. That gentle man was Vivian's late father. The frame gathered dust for so long that the busy crew completely ignored it. Upstairs by the corporate suites, a vintage championship race car sat parked behind thick glass. A small brass plate on the pedestal simply read, in tiny letters that wealthy visitors always ignored, "Legacy platform designed by FEO." But here is the truth. No fancy new engineer ever asked what those letters stood for. Meanwhile, 2 floors above our greasy workshop, inside a sleek corner office overlooking the sunny test track. You and I know carrying a massive legacy is tough. Vivian Sterling was learning it firsthand. She grew up around our engines, spending her childhood down in the pit lanes. She learned the names of our bolts long before she ever memorized her state capitals. We would see her on her dad's lap, listening closely to the race day radio chatter. Her father was a boss who truly believed in us. that the company's real soul lived in the quiet people holding it together. He built sterling apex on that truth, winning championships by honoring the quiet hands behind the scenes. But when he passed, the corporate board moved incredibly fast. Suddenly, corporate suits took over with their fancy strategies and consultant slide decks. Cold quarterly numbers completely replaced his warm walks through our busy work bays. People got promoted for tracking spreadsheets instead of actually feeling out a true torque curve. Then there was 28-year-old Vivian, feeling the weight of every whisper calling her the heiress. She learned to wear his title like heavy armor she had not quite earned the right to remove yet. She was not naturally cold. Honestly, she was just a scared kid forced into a role that forbade fear. She started wearing sharp dresses and structured suits, learning the hard way that those boardroom sharks saw any soft spot as pure weakness. She would practice every single sentence in the mirror before facing the press. Late at night, she studied her father's old letters, searching for the secret to earning our quiet, hard-earned respect. But what she actually found instead was the slow, crushing pressure of being judged daily against a racing legend whose massive shoes she could not fill. Dermot Blake used to be one of her father's trusted lieutenants. We all knew he had waited his entire career for this exact moment. Let's look at his game plan. He knew stressed young executives hated hearing about mechanical problems. She only wanted to hear about easy, painless fixes. So he fed her slick, confident reports every single week. And beneath those slick fixes he buried every warning from us veteran mechanics who trusted a humming engine over a shiny tablet. He convinced her the sport's future lay in data, digital simulations, and ruthless executive control. He kept whispering that quiet, dedicated craftsmen like Flynn were just outdated relics. Vivian bought into the lie because she desperately needed to. She needed us to represent the obsolete past so she could project a brilliant future. During the main briefing the night before the launch, she stood over that giant glass table and warned our whole crew that any deviation from her approved script during the public test run meant instant firing. She spoke dead slow, locking eyes with every single person in the room. But she had absolutely no idea in that moment that she was actually building the exact trap she would soon stumble right into. She just knew she could not risk another rumor or one more doubting look from investors. Another headline claiming the young heiress was completely losing her grip on power. Later that night, as she walked through our quiet, dark work bay, she stopped by the safety zone, where a little girl with a stuffed rabbit sat waiting for her dad's late shift to end. Vivian almost gave the child a smile, almost. We have all let pressure win. Blinded by the spotlight, she turned away cold before that smile could ever land. The Apex R9 was built on Flynn's chassis. Our quiet master Flynn drew those exact lines years ago, back when the suits actually let him claim his work. The flashy new team just slapped modern electronics over his bones. Turbocharged engines, electronic ignition maps, smart fuel injection, and telemetry. On flashy spec sheets it looked perfect to Flynn's expert garbage. He heard the hidden warning for the first time 2 nights ago, right during a basic low-load test in our workshop. The engine hummed beautifully across that entire low-speed range. But look closer. When the load shifted and turbo-spooled, there was a dry knock. So quiet you would miss it, hiding right between 2 sensor readings. Flynn recognized that exact knock. He heard it years ago, on a prototype that tore itself to pieces on the track. The ignition was firing milliseconds too early for the pressure building inside that chamber. At slow speeds it meant absolutely nothing. At full throttle, loaded up, with the secondary fuel line pushed to its absolute limit, that meant a blown engine block, so he warned Otis. Otis just checked his flashy tablet, said the diagnostics looked green. Flynn quietly asked him to pull the ignition map. Otis claimed only senior engineers got access, so Flynn found Dermot. Dermot sat in his office polishing a flashy presentation slide. In crisp white letters, Apex R9 restoring the legacy. When Flynn knocked, Dermot did not even bother looking up. Flynn explained the knock, the timing, the load curve, and the fuel heat. He warned him directly that the car would not survive a full throttle track run. Dermot listened the exact way an arrogant boss listens to noise. Like background noise he had already decided to ignore. You know the type. Flynn, he sighed, patronizing him, you were useful 10 years ago. Today we rely entirely on data. Flynn just answered quietly, data only shows what the sensors measure. The knock I hear hides right between two sensors. That is the exact kind of quiet warning that in a healthy company would have instantly stopped a meeting. In hours, it stripped his access completely. Dermot ordered us techs to keep him far away from the prototype. He smiled, telling us the floor runs better without a quiet guy second-guessing his shiny tools. Later that night, Flynn quietly wrote down everything he heard. The exact engine speed where that faint knock finally appeared. The rising temperature of the auxiliary fuel line. The strange behavior of the ignition timing on. The race dashboard he was barely allowed to see. He folded the page, sliding it safely into his worn jacket pocket. You and I know the quiet ones write the truth down before disaster strikes. Walking out to the dark parking lot later, his daughter grabbed his hand. Daddy, why do you keep listening to it? She asked. Flynn just smiled. A tight smile that never reached his eyes. Because sometimes machines speak very softly, he told her. If you ignore them, they will eventually scream by tearing themselves to pieces. You and I are about to see just how prophetic that warning would become. On launch morning, his babysitter bailed just 20 minutes before he had to leave. Her own kid had a fever, and he had completely missed the school planning day scribbled on his calendar. He strapped Louisa into his truck, drove to the garage, and tucked her behind the VIP rope. He quietly warned her to stay put, promising he would be right back. He kissed the top of her head and got straight to work. Totally unaware he was about to lose his job right before her eyes. Vivian caught sight of the little girl just as she approached the podium. For a brief second before the cameras rolled, her cold defenses melted. Remembering what it was like growing up in the pit lane. Sitting on stacked tires, watching her father work alongside mechanics in greasy coveralls. Then a suit tapped her shoulder. The memory vanished, and she ignored the child until the worst possible moment. Flynn drove them home in absolute silence. Louisa sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching a stuffed rabbit tight. Nearly 20 minutes later, she finally asked him, barely whispering, if the powerful bosses at the track thought he was a bad man. He parked on their gravel driveway and turned to look at his daughter. He did not curse the CEO who fired him or attack the loud engineers who ignored his warnings. He simply gave his little girl the only honest answer. People misunderstanding who you are does not make you bad, he said. But you must live so honestly that eventually the truth has room to stand. Back inside, he opened a hallway closet she was never allowed to search through. He pulled down an old metal lockbox and placed it right on the kitchen table. He lifted the lid and simply let his hands rest on the contents inside. Faded yellow blueprints, an old championship trophy bearing his name, and letters in Vivian's father's own handwriting. He did not call a single soul. He did not reach for the phone to angrily defend his reputation. He learned long ago that a man who must broadcast his own worth has already lost the room completely. The real truth would have to speak through the engine data, or not at all. Back at headquarters, the undeniable truth was already starting to leak out. Vivian sat alone in the glass boardroom, watching the launch footage on a massive screen. Dermot stood right beside her, writing a fake statement about a low-level mechanic violating protocol and getting instantly fired. He tossed around slick words like decisive and exemplary leadership. He smiled through all those lies, but Vivian definitely did not. Frame by frame, she watched Flynn approach the race car again. And she finally noticed what her anger had completely blinded her to earlier. He was not panicking. He was not acting suspicious at all. He moved like a top surgeon, performing a critical procedure he had mastered years ago. She rewound the security tape. You and I can see it clearly now. He was not destroying that engine. He was saving it. Stick with me here, she called the poster boy inside. The flashy young engineer walked in looking absolutely pale. Terrified, he confessed that Flynn, the quiet expert he ignored, had warned them yesterday about a strange engine knock during a low-load test. Dermot immediately tried to shut him down. But Vivian simply raised her hand, silencing the loud, prestigious boardroom instantly. Otis nervously kept spilling the whole story, detailing the silent mechanic's quiet confidence. He admitted trusting flashy telemetry over a seasoned quiet veteran who lacked a fancy title on his shirt. While the flashy engineer sweated, the heavy door swung open. A terrified young shop technician muttered in a shaking voice. He said they started the race car again, and that mystery engine knock came back much louder. Exactly where the silent expert predicted, Vivian locked eyes with Dermot. For the very first time since her father's funeral, she finally saw past the flashy charm. Standing there was just a guilty man caught red-handed. Archie Bennett was 62 years old. The retired mastermind had a silver beard and the deliberate walk of a true garage veteran. He arrived on Vivian's direct request, meant to be the guest of honor for this flashy launch. But his flight got delayed. You and I know how tense garages get. When he arrived, the launch was ruined and a heavy silence hung over the bay. He walked straight into the boardroom without even knocking. The master listened silently for 30 seconds, instantly reading the corporate drama. Then he asked the one question that shattered their flashy illusions. "Who?" he asked, keeping his voice low and eyes freezing. "Just told me that Flynn Callahan sabotaged the race car." Dermot nervously tried to chuckle. He dismissed it as a minor staff issue, claiming it was nothing their guest should worry about. Archie completely ignored him. He walked past the polished boardroom table, past Vivian, and right past the guard. He headed straight to the bay, where the broken prototype sat with its hood open. The master silently inspected the auxiliary fuel lines and ignition couplers, spotting a tiny grease smudge left by Flynn's quiet, expert hand. He stared at the ruined vehicle for a long time, just standing there in absolute silence. When the veteran finally turned around, his voice was dead calm. "He saved this engine." Vivian asked how he could possibly know that. Archie replied without ever looking away from the damaged prototype. "Because the genius who taught me to hear that exact mechanical failure," he said, "was Flynn." The entire garage fell completely silent. Vivian ordered her assistant to retrieve the old archives, the blueprints from before her father passed. The loud-mouthed Dermot protested immediately. He argued those old records were completely irrelevant to their current investigation. But Vivian, having spent the last hour, "You and I both know how flashy men bury the silent truth by calling it irrelevant. Just drop the hammer. Open them." The massive screen flooded with long-hidden secrets. Blueprint designs, cooling systems, the quiet ignition baselines. Torque curves, the silent blueprints behind racing glory. Tucked away on every legendary design was a quiet, modest little signature. F. Callahan, the silent master engineer. Archie stood by the screen. Look closely here, because he finally gave a loud tribute to a quiet genius he had secretly respected for decades. He faced Vivian and explained Flynn was the youngest chief automotive designer in the firm's history. He did not just design cars. This quiet master built them manually, testing them alone on the track. He listened to their engines run, tuning their performance one cylinder at a time. He explained that every glittering championship cup in the Sterling Apex lobby was built on ideas Flynn quietly drew long before modern software existed. He revealed that when his wife passed away, Flynn begged Vivian's father for a quiet, low-profile role, just so he could go home and raise his young daughter. Her father loved Flynn like family. He granted that humble demotion without a second thought. Those personnel files were quietly sealed. The loud, flashy new managers never cared to dig into the past. Vivian sank slowly into the nearest chair. She suddenly recalled the small voice of a 6-year-old girl who said, right before being kicked off the track in shame, that her quiet dad fixed whatever was broken. That sentence sounded sweet back then. Now it landed like a heavy, guilty verdict. You and I know that sick feeling. Vivian felt it hit instantly. A private, behind-closed-doors apology simply would not cut it. She had publicly dismissed the quiet master holding everything together. She let the loud media paint him as a corporate saboteur. She let his young daughter hear that cruel judgment, a kid she completely ignored during the loud chaos. The raw truth, much like the damage, had to go public. She suspended Dermot right there on the spot. She ordered the PR team to lock down all press releases. She summoned the board, investors, arrogant engineers, and quiet floor mechanics. And the very same reporters who filmed Flynn getting fired, back to the main garage. Once the bay was packed, she walked to the front, holding absolutely no notes. She declared 3 facts very clearly. First, the quiet Flynn Callahan never sabotaged the Apex R9. Second, Flynn actually prevented a massive engine blowout that, at full throttle, could have caused serious injuries and destroyed a $14 million supercar prototype. And third, she announced that Flynn was the brilliant mastermind whose quiet hands built the technical spine of every winning car they ever made. Archie then stepped up beside her and, "Stay with me here." Archie explained the error with incredible patience. The tiny ignition mistiming, the backup fuel pump pushed way past its safe limits. The exact second that vibration would have triggered a total catastrophic blowout. He displayed the internal diagnostic system logs. He pointed to the exact time the dangerous engine settings were loaded into the prototype. That timestamp was logged 48 hours before the launch. The arrogant user profile attached to it belonged to Dermot Blake. Dermot stumbled over his words, claiming he was just optimizing the race car. Archie did not even raise his voice. He calmly said that optimization without simulation, without safety reviews or signed paperwork, was just reckless guesswork. It was pure negligence wrapped in arrogant confidence. Dermot was not just wrong about the engine design. He broke the same shop rules he had weaponized against a quiet master like Flynn. Those wealthy investors did not explode. They went dead silent. That is how money men calculate exactly how angry they can safely afford to get. The board members squirmed in their expensive leather chairs, waiting for Vivian to make her next move. But she did not hide. She faced those executives without even blinking. "I made a decision too quickly. I trusted an empty title instead of the truth. And I fired the actual genius who saved this car." Then she projected Flynn's original engineering blueprints up on the wall. We all watched the true design history of our team scroll across that screen. Every single blue schematic was signed in Flynn's familiar, quiet handwriting. Us older mechanics standing in the back, guys who had built engines beside him long before he was pushed down, just lowered our heads. I will not lie, I had to wipe my eyes with my greasy sleeve. You and I know the quietest hands build the fastest cars. Justice takes years, but Flynn was not even there. The CEO delivered her grand apology to everyone except the silent creator who actually deserved it. Staring at that empty grease spot where Flynn used to work, Vivian finally got it. She realized she still had one last job to do. And she certainly could not do it from behind a corporate podium. She walked out of the shop and actually drove herself for a change. She ordered her assistant not to call ahead to his house. She put his address in the GPS and drove 20 minutes straight through empty farm country and quiet intersections, finally pulling up to his gravel driveway. It was a modest one-story house with white siding and a little kid's bike parked on the porch. She sat still in her expensive luxury car for a full minute before opening the door. Flynn answered the door himself. He had traded his dirty work overalls for a clean, plain gray t-shirt. He just quietly stared at her, no shock, no smugness, and no anger. Behind him, his little girl Louisa peeked out from the hallway. Holding a stuffed rabbit, she watched the angry lady who caused that awful day with cautious, steady eyes, knowing how completely unpredictable grown-ups could be. Wearing her expensive tailored suit, the CEO looked entirely out of place on that simple porch. We all know corporate power looks small when facing the quiet creators it wronged. So she abandoned her polished corporate pitch. She simply admitted to him that she had personally reviewed the engine data, that she saw his secret design history, and finally knew exactly what Dermot did, that she saw what he had sacrificed and realized the terrible damage she had caused. Flynn just listened in silence. "Let us pay close attention here." He asked just one question. "Did you know all of that?" He said, "Before or after my daughter heard you brand me a man who broke protocol?" Our boss didn't have a quick comeback. She knew any corporate spin would just make her look worse. Finally, she just whispered, "After." Then, Flynn's little girl stepped up, looking straight at her. "Are you here to take my dad away again?" she asked, her tiny voice cutting right through the garage. The CEO did the only decent thing she had left. She knelt down on the dusty floor, getting right on the kid's level. "No," she admitted. "I came to tell you I was totally wrong. Your dad didn't wreck that engine. He's the one who saved it. And I'm sorry I scared you." The little girl just stared back, silent. She turned to Flynn. Kids always look to their true anchor when they aren't quite sure how to feel. Flynn placed a reassuring, steady hand on her shoulder. He faced the boss, speaking with absolute calm, completely free of bitterness. He told her that corporate cash and cheap titles couldn't just sweep this disgrace away. If she truly wanted his skills back in the shop, she'd have to admit her mistake right in front of the crew who watched him get thrown out. His daughter deserved to hear it, and so did every quiet mechanic on this garage floor. The racing media needed the truth too. The boss nodded immediately. She invited him back to the shop not as some desperate rehired hand, but as the real mastermind who could fix the supercar and salvage their corporate name. Flynn let the silence stretch out. He had every right to walk away. He'd earned the right to tell them no. Instead, he looked at his daughter, who was quietly studying his face. With a small smile, he asked her if she thought he should take the job. Louisa thought about it, clutching her soft toy rabbit tight. Then she said, "Daddy, if that fast car is still broken, will you fix it?" Flynn smiled a little, then looked back at the big boss. "I don't fix engines just because people deserve my help," he said. "I fix things because it's simply the right thing to do." The next morning, you and I could feel a totally different energy. The wealthy investors returned. The corporate suits showed up, along with the racing cameras. They even dragged Dermot back, flanked by 2 beefy corporate security guards. They shoved him into the back row, forcing him to watch. The bay was just as packed as yesterday, but the atmosphere had totally changed. We could all feel a very specific kind of tension. It was that quiet stillness when a massive overdue debt is finally paid in full. Flynn walked in holding his daughter's hand, wearing no fancy suit. Just his clean dark blue work overalls, our team logo sitting proud right on his chest. Louisa held his hand tight, her favorite stuffed rabbit dangling from her arm. They walked slowly past the elite engineers and nervous executives, refusing to rush. And all of us, without a word, stepped back to clear their path. The head designer met them halfway across the garage. There was no grand speech. He simply admitted, in a hushed voice, that he should have listened to him. Flynn just nodded. Because the quiet ones are the ones who actually build success. Look, I didn't need a long speech to humble that young engineer. Some lessons teach themselves, especially when you just let the silence settle. CEO Vivian stood right beside the prototype. She didn't try to offer any fake corporate warmth. She just stepped aside, like you would for a surgeon, letting me near the championship car. I set to work exactly the way I always had. Hood raised, my hands were completely clean. I shut my eyes for a moment, simply listening to the engine bay. I switched off the automated tuning system completely. I restored the ignition map to a baseline I wrote years ago, the one that brought us victories. Then I replaced a critical heat sensor that had drifted way out of tolerance. I simply gave the test driver a quick nod. The Apex R9 fired right up with a smooth rumble, 0 knock. Absolutely no smoke. The driver eased the car out onto the track. The first lap was clean, the second was even faster. The third lap absolutely shattered our track record, forcing a senior engineer to laugh out loud before catching himself and apologizing to the room. When the prototype finally rolled to a complete stop, nobody cheered right away, unlike the loud celebrations they had prepared yesterday. This time, the mood was entirely different. You and I have seen it before. Slow, heavy applause from executives who almost traded my career and my daughter's trust for pure arrogance. Vivian walked directly over to where my daughter and I stood. She didn't hide behind some fancy corporate podium. In front of everyone, she offered me the role of chief race engineer. I didn't answer immediately. I told her I would only return on my own terms. Every single technical concern raised by the crew on the floor. Regardless of title, age, or experience, the person speaking up must be listened to. Nobody would ever be fired without a truly honest, fair review first. And Sterling Apex had to establish a genuine support system for single parents, so that no parent is ever forced to make that painful choice, having to decide between being there for my child or getting basic respect at work. Vivian agreed immediately, right in front of everyone. The board didn't say a single word. Those wealthy investors stayed totally silent. Frankly, a few looked relieved, like a question they were terrified to ask had finally been resolved. We've all been there, much later, once the news cameras finally left. I stood by the edge of that empty track with Louisa resting on my shoulders. Her stuffed rabbit dangled loosely from her hand. The Apex R9 sat silently in the garage bay behind us. Vivian stayed back respectfully, content for once to let the spotlight shine entirely on the person who actually earned it. Louisa leaned forward, resting her chin softly on top of my head. "Daddy," she asked quietly, "do they finally know that you built these cars?" I just stared out across that long ribbon of empty asphalt. "Maybe," I whispered. She quietly thought about what I said. Then she softly whispered, "Are you happy?" I just squeezed her ankles a little bit tighter. He remembered those quiet years keeping things running behind the scenes, and the brutal night they cast him aside. Then came the morning he returned, carrying no anger and seeking no revenge. He recalled his late wife, who taught this silent craftsman that true kindness matters far more than proving yourself right. "I am at peace," he whispered, "because the world finally saw that real value never has to shout." Back in the quiet, cooling shadows of the empty garage, those championship cars sat waiting, built by him, right where he parked them. You see, some men spend their entire lives quietly building success that the famous world forgets to honor. But we know that when real value is finally revealed, it has no need for revenge. It only needs to step calmly into the room, set the record straight, and let the quiet silence do the talking.